Hello there. So of course, we are now approaching the halfway mark of June's Season 12. So of course, that means that the monthly global tournaments will once again be making a return. In this mode, you're actually able to try out a ton of new decks that you couldn't before, because of course these tournaments are capped at a tournament standard level 9. In addition to that, there's also a ton of good rewards as well as trade tokens galore to be earned just by getting as many wins as you possibly can. And for those of you that are good enough, of course, the top 100 players will earn that exclusive emote as well as 100,000 gold. Therefore, I'm pretty sure you're going to want to do quite good in this tournament and get as many wins as you possibly can. Hey guys, Legendaray here, and today we're going to be going over the top 5 decks that you want to run in this upcoming global tournament. With both the release of the Skeleton Dragons as well as a pretty sizable buff to the Prince, this meta has seen quite a drastic shift from the previous. So of course, as usual, I'm going to be showcasing 5 decks that are consistently seen on top ladder as well as in grand challenges that honestly perform very well and are also relatively simple for you guys to pick up. But before I get into that, if you could please leave a like down below and subscribe to my channel, that would be greatly appreciated. Also, go check me out on Instagram and Twitter, links down below. And if you'd like to support me in game, feel free to use code Legendaray in the shop. And with all that out of the way, let's get right into the list. Number 1. Lava Hound Control. So, Lava Hound decks are absolutely just taking off with the release of the Skeleton Dragons. It was actually falling off during that first week of the meta, but as soon as those Skeleton Dragons were released, man, this archetype saw a comeback. As you can see in this deck, there is just so much synergy between the Skeleton Dragons and the rest of this deck. More specifically, Fireball needs to be used on the Barbarians, the Skeleton Dragons, the Night Witch, and even the Lava Pups. So if you're able to manage all your Fireball bait cards effectively, you're able to really dominate your opponents in those matches. So starting off this match, of course, you're going to be rather passive at the start, and if they do play one of their air counters in the back, then I would generally recommend you play your Lava Hound in the back. That's because one of their air counters is out of cycle, and you can just take that air counter out, leaving them struggling to take out your Lava Hound push. Supporting that Lava Hound, obviously you've got the Night Witch and the Inferno Dragon, and then send in that Miner as the Lava Hound crosses the bridge or when it's about to die to allow that Miner to tank for those Lava Pups. You do have to watch out quite a bit for spell value, however, because as you can see, this deck has basically swapped out the Baby Dragon for the Skeleton Dragons, so if you pile those Skeleton Dragons and the Night Witch and the Inferno Dragon on an offense, your opponents are going to just get so much value with a single Fireball. All in all, this deck is honestly really easy and simple for you guys to pick up. If there's one thing that you want to take away from this deck, is that you're going to be constantly building up those big Lava Hound pushes from the back corner, very lightly defending any pushes in the opposite lane, and then go in with those Skeleton Dragons to get as much value as possible. Together, the 2 Skeleton Dragons do double the DPS of a Baby Dragon, so they are really deadly, and your opponents have to immediately have an answer to them, or else they are going to be in big trouble. Number 2. Prince Graveyard. So this deck is a pretty new graveyard variant, and of course it's going to be running the Prince, which is one of the cards that received a buff in the last update. So this new graveyard deck is obviously quite different from the traditional splash yard in that there aren't that many splashing troops. In fact, there actually isn't a single troop that deals splash damage. However, the playstyle is actually still quite simple. That's because most graveyard decks are control decks, meaning that you're going to be focusing on defense in order to build effective offense. Starting off a match, you're going to want to cycle maybe your Goblin Cage or a Log. I wouldn't necessarily want to cycle either of my air counters, but if the opponent really isn't making any moves, then I would consider it. Aside from that, especially if you've played down a Goblin Cage, your opponents are bound to react to that, because once that Goblin Cage pops in about 20 seconds, that Goblin Brawler is going to be an immediate threat to your opponent's towers. So once they react to the Goblin Cage, you can just go ahead and play proper counters to that. If they play anything tanky, obviously go in with a Prince, allow it to charge up and get as much damage as possible. If they play an air counter, go in with your E-Wiz and then your Mega Minion, or use the Ice Golem to kite everything into the opposite lane. There's so many defensive answers in this deck and so many troops that actually have counter push value. For example, the Goblin Cage, when it's used on defense, can often lead to a surviving Goblin Brawler, which will then cross the bridge, allowing you to play an offensive graveyard. Same thing with the Prince as well as the E-Wiz. Aside from that, you're going to actually want to cycle quite a few graveyards onto your opponent's towers. A lot of opponents will have great answers to your graveyard, but the thing with graveyard is that it's a pretty RNG card, meaning that if you constantly just keep throwing those graveyards onto the opponent's towers, you're going to constantly be getting 1 to 2 or even more skeleton hits onto the tower. Your opponents are going to have to defend, giving you possible poison value as well, also just constantly chipping away at your opponent's towers. That being said, I do want to urge that you do not overcommit on your offenses, because it can honestly be really easy to just throw down a graveyard poison, but that's 9 elixir that your opponents might be able to counter quite easily, leaving you dry on elixir when it comes to defending their counter push. Number 3. Golem Battle Healer. Oh gosh, what the heck is this? Alrighty, so this is another new deck that really takes advantage of those newly released skeleton dragons. Of course, those skeleton dragons are rather weak, so this deck also has the battle healer in there to provide some constant support to make sure that those skeleton dragons can get a ton of value. That being said, this deck is one of the easier golem decks to play because there are a ton of cheap 2 and 3 elixir cards. So starting off this match, I would generally play pretty passive, maybe cycling one of your cards in the back, but aside from that, you're going to not really go on the offense until your opponent makes a move. Once they do, just play troops reactively and try and gain an elixir advantage one way or another. After that, you can go ahead and play down that golem in the back. Of course, they're going to try and rush opposite lane with whatever they have, but you actually have so many answers to anything that they might bring your way. Guards are very great for any kind of single targeting unit, as well as some splashers as well, and the Mega Minion and the Bar Barrel are other super duper cheap answers that can take care of a ton of pushes. In addition to that, you can even split those skeleton dragons in the back so that one can support your golem and the other can defend a push in the opposite lane. Transitioning onto the offense of this deck, so you're just gonna, put troops behind the golem, play down the battle healer, the skeleton dragon, the night witch, as well as that Mega Minion, using that tornado with those skeleton dragons to get as much value as possible. Now, one thing again I do want to note is that just like that Lava Hound deck, you're going to want to watch out for spell value. So generally, when you play a golem push on offense, you're not going to want to place all of your units down. Maybe just play down those skeleton dragons, or maybe play just a battle healer and a night witch, because that way you're actually saving some of your own offensive push so that when your opponents use their spells to defend, then you can go ahead and spam everything in, knowing that they do not have proper answers to all of your cards. Again, use that tornado to pull everything into the golem and into the splash range of those skeleton dragons, as that can actually be super duper crucial when it comes to making sure that your opponent's defensive troops die so that they have absolutely no chance of even building a counter push. Number 4, Prince Bait. So this deck is a little bit harder to play. I'd say it's probably the hardest one to pick up from scratch of these 5, but this deck is definitely super deadly if you know what you're doing. So bait decks are always just, in the meta. They're not always top tier, but this time with the newly buffed Prince, this variation of bait has definitely made a comeback. So with this deck, you're obviously going to be constantly cycling your cards. It's a bit of a faster cycle, so starting off the match, throwing down a Goblin Barrel, split Goblin Gangs in the back, place a Princess in the back, and try and determine which small spells your opponents have, because that's going to be really essential when figuring out how to break through on an offense. Once you figured that out, you're basically just going to want to outcycle those small spells. There's a ton of ways to to do it. One way is to just utilize your fast cycle, because you actually have a pretty fast cycle with this deck. The other way is just to bait those small spells out. Now this has uses on both offense and defense as well. For example, if you're defending a push, just throw a goblin barrel towards the opponent's tower. They're gonna have to use their small spell on that, freeing you up to use your goblin gang or your rascals on a defense. Alternatively, if you go ahead and bait out a log on a defense, then you're free to, just spam all your bait cards at your opponent's tower to try and get as much damage as possible. Of course, the prince is in there to take out any big tanks, as well as apply some quick opposite lane pressure if your opponents commit something really heavy in the back. But all in all, the goal of this deck is to just be constantly chipping damage and constantly applying pressure so that your opponents just have no chance of building any sort of push up on their offense. Finally, the rocket is another super duper essential card. Not only is it the way for you guys to deal with all of those air units that you might face, but it's also a way to finish off your matches. Once you have your opponent's towers down low enough, maybe try placing a princess at the bridge and allowing it to just consistently get 1 or 2 hits onto your opponent's towers, which can eventually bring it down to rocket range. Rockets do 432 damage to towers at tournament standard, so that's a pretty important number that you guys should memorize. Giant Prince. So this deck is rather interesting actually, but it's a deck that I've actually faced quite a few times on ladder and seen quite a few times in grand challenges. So this deck is a bit of a faster cycle giant deck. So starting off the match, you can obviously just cycle some of your cards just to get to the important stuff. So cycling that heal spirit, cycling a zap onto the opponent's towers, and usually you're going to want to let your opponents make the first move, but if they're really going to wait, you can maybe play a Mega Minion or a Night Witch in the back. This is a faster variation of beatdown, meaning that you're going to be constantly building up smaller pushes over and over again until eventually your opponents will begin to crack on their defenses. So play that Night Witch in the back, play down a giant, play down a prince, play down those skeleton dragons, and maybe throw in a rage as well. The rage spell is honestly quite underrated in my opinion, because for 2 elixir, it makes all of your units move so much faster, and especially with prince, skeleton dragons, and bats, those are 3 fast moving units in this deck that can just get so much value, especially when they are sped up. The heal spirit can apply so much value as well, healing about half the HP of both the skeleton dragons as well as the Night Witch. In addition, the heal spirit also lets you cycle quite quickly, so that just adds to the deadliness of this deck. All in all, it's another relatively simple deck to play. Just constantly apply pressure by building up giant pushes, while also being smart to make sure that you don't take too much damage on defense, because this is a deck that you're going to actually have to make relatively little mistakes to actually win, simply because there isn't a big spell, meaning that there isn't too much room for error in terms of wasting your troops. That being said, the skeleton dragons are so deadly in this deck because they force out an immediate response from your opponents, or else they're going to pretty much act as your medium spell in this deck. So there we go. Those are the 5 decks that I would recommend you guys run in this upcoming global tournament. All 5 of these decks are seen quite often in both grand challenges as well as top ladder, and with both the prince as well as the skeleton dragons being boosted to your king tower level for the season, you might even be able to try these decks out on ladder as well. So of course, best of luck in the global tournament to all of you guys, but unfortunately guys, that's all I've got time for in today's episode. Huge thanks to all of my channel members. You guys are the absolute G's. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like down below as well as a subscription to my channel, and as always, this is Legendaray, and I'm signing off. See you guys next time.